evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming this evening to our lecture by Professor Ian Morris on the shape of ancient civilization. It is really very heroic of you to be here when I'm aware that we're at the very tail end of a very busy spring term, so we very much appreciate it. Civilization is a term that has re-emerged in the 21st century after decades of relative academic contempt. It appears now in popular claims about clashes between Muslim and non-Muslim traditions, for example, in debates about the constitution of Europe and which country should be in and which should be out, and in arguments for supranational identities such as that of China or India. Civilization and its sister concept of barbarity therefore deserve renewed scrutiny. The Centre for Research into the Dynamics of Civilization, or CREDOC as it's known, was established a year and a half ago to stimulate such scrutiny at UCL, but also to argue that civilization is productive to think with, that unlike the concepts of culture, society, or the nation, civilization encompasses a scale and a duration that permits innovative thinking across disciplines. That a civilizational approach can benefit the study of, for example, language, food, religion, race, technology, the environment, inequality, conflict. CREDOC has been organising and continues to plan lectures, seminars and workshops at UCL to stimulate debate and cross-disciplinary research activity on civilizational issues, including a series that looks at critiques of civilization from particular disciplinary perspectives. To date, we've had seminars in that context on the critiques of civilization. We've had seminars from the perspective of political theory and archaeology last term and ancient history this term, and with plans for anthropology next term and museology in the autumn. We have also run a series of lectures on what we've described as civilizational regions, including Wang Mingming, who I'm delighted to see is here with us again this evening, on the current self-representation of China as a 5,000-year-old civilization, and Wendy Doniger on the contemporary civilizational clash between forms of Hinduism. In the next academic year, we're proposing to have similar regional lectures on Africa and the Middle East. This evening, however, we turn not to the present, but to the past, and not to a distinct region, but to patterns of civilization and the benefit of their exploration on the global level. To explore the shape of ancient civilization, we are privileged to have here today Professor Ian Morris, Professor of Classics and of History at Stanford University. Now, Professor Morris, I think we can safely say, is not afraid to embrace the big picture and the large questions. Starting out from his perspective as an economic historian of the Greek city-state and an archaeologist of ancient Greek colonies, he has repositioned classical antiquity within an evolutionary approach to world history. To give you just a small flavour of the large questions and big histories that he's embraced, I just want to mention a few of his works and their themes. So from 2010, Why the West Rules for Now, compared Eastern and Western histories, their grounding in his argument in material forces, and the directions for our future that the patterning of those material histories would suggest. 2013, The Measure of Civilization, he gave further consideration to the idea of the West's past dominance of the world, to how to quantify the long-term development of societies above and beyond the level of culture, and to what the prospects for humanity might be once we have established those quantitative approaches. 2014, War, What Is It Good For?, argued controversially for the role of conflict in civilization as both harmful but also paradoxically productive. And now I think just this minute out in March 2015, Foragers, Farmers and Fossil Fuels concerns the various revolutions in energy capture, the stagings of first foraging, farming and then fossil fuels, and the argument that each necessitates a particular type of society and particular social values, with new mechanisms for energy capture in the 21st century, therefore implying that we should expect the overturning of old values and the introduction of new ones. Now, these are all extraordinarily ambitious and highly engaging histories. These are histories that are material, quantitative, comparative, and evolutionary. They have both won awards and been the subject of controversy. Today's lecture emerges from a new project to explore the benefits of thinking about antiquity not as fragmented into Greco-Roman, Egyptian, Assyrian, African, Chinese, and other such antiquities, but to rethink antiquity as a single global entity and what the benefits of doing so might be. After Professor Morris's talk, there will be brief responses from Kevin MacDonald, UCL African Archaeology, and Corinna Riva, UCL Mediterranean Archaeology, and then we will open the discussion to you all. Because we're recording the event, it means that even though you can be heard without a microphone, when we get to the point of inviting questions, we will need to ask you to use one to ensure that your question is recorded, unless of course you don't want us to hear what it is that you've been saying in perpetuity. At the end of the discussion, at about 7:45, there is a reception in the Anthropology Common Room, which is the building next door. Now, word has it that one can actually get from this lecture theatre into anthropology through that door. Word has it too that it's been unlocked for us or de-alarmed, but we will find out at 7:45 whether that is true. And then I should say that tomorrow, on Friday the 27th, we are going to continue these debates about how to reapproach, to reanalyze the concept of antiquity with a workshop that is being organized by Hans Mies from the UCL History Department, and that starts at 1:30 in the Pearson Lecture Theatre. If you want to attend, you're very welcome, and you can just check again on the CREDOC website, you'll find all the details there. I and Mike Rowlands, my co-director for CREDOC, would also very much welcome suggestions from colleagues about further events at UCL that might stimulate civilisational research. But meanwhile, I think I would very much like to ask you to welcome Ian Morris this evening to speak to us about the shape of ancient civilization.
Okay, well, thank you. Am I loud enough? Can everybody hear okay? Okay, I'll take that as a resounding agreement with my question. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's very nice to be here, and I'd like to thank Maria and Mike for inviting me to speak to you this evening, and thank Hans for organising the event tomorrow, which I'm looking forward to very much, and Corinna Riva and Kevin MacDonald for being the respondents to this lecture I'm going to give this evening. You should thank Corinna and Kevin as well, because because they're going to be responding to this thing, I actually had to write up a script for them to read, which means it's much less likely than usual that I will launch off into some 2-hour digression about nothing in particular, which would keep you here all evening and prevent you from doing something useful like sitting in a pub or something. So you all owe them a great debt of thanks. So, okay, this evening I'm going to talk about the shape of ancient civilization. Now, I remember exactly the moment when I first discovered that we were living in a globalized world. It was October 1996, and I had just been appointed as the chair of the Department of Classics at Stanford University. And I was sitting there, and a memo literally came across my desk. This was back in the days when memos came on pieces of paper with like black letters printed on them. This memo came across my desk from the dean's office. And the memo announced the dean had just become aware of globalization. And he wanted to know what I was doing to make classical studies more global. And he wanted a response right away. Now, fortunately, I'd been warned by a predecessor in the job of chair of classics that I should immediately throw away every memo that came from the dean's office, on the principle that the only way you could know what was important and what wasn't was that if it was important, they'd send you another memo. So I immediately did this and heard nothing more about this globalization issue for the rest of my time as chair. In fact, it didn't come up again for another 3 years, by which time I had been elevated to the dean's office and I was now the one sending out the annoying memos that everybody ignored. Now, on the whole, my impression is that ancient historians react to memos on globalization with about the same level of enthusiasm that I showed back in 1996. So this is something, the general feeling I think is this is something that we don't need to trouble ourselves about unduly. And I think that the reason for this is pretty clear. For well over 1,000 years, when people have thought about the ancient world, they tended to do it on the continental or subcontinental scale, rather than on a global scale. But my main claim tonight in this talk is going to be that we now know enough about the ancient world to know that thinking about it on the continental, subcontinental scale is actually a mistake. And I want to suggest that there really is a global level story about antiquity that we're now in a position to tell. Once we do start telling it, I think we're able to see how we can't really understand very much at all about our own world unless we first understand this global level story about the ancient world. I think it's a very, very important story to tell. Now, I think the appeal of the continental scale view of the ancient world, ancient worlds, the appeal I think is obvious enough. For well over 1,000 years, people across much of the world tended to look back fondly on a lost golden age, a regional golden age, tended to be one of various kinds of political or military triumph in the region where they lived. This lost golden age here, the European one, looking back to ancient Greece. And here we see the Greeks being smitten by the gods for taking all the Europeans and losing them down the back of the couch. Each part of the world, through a big section of the world, has this ancient golden age that people tend to look back to as the founding moment in the creation of their continental, subcontinental tradition. Most of these regions come complete with founding fathers of various kinds who started off great intellectual traditions to which the people in that region feel that their civilization really sort of comes from this great lost tradition. A selection of founding fathers that people in different parts of the world look back to. Within each region, for many centuries, knowledge of the writings of this lost classical past, this has tended to be a cultural yardstick by which learned gentlemen, and usually was gentlemen up till recently, learned gentlemen could measure each other's worth according to how well the other learned gentlemen knew about these local, continental, classical traditions. Now, as far as I can make out, people didn't think very much about comparing these continental traditions, at least until about the 18th century, at which point Europeans, rather to their own surprise, Europeans find themselves taking over the world. And they're rather baffled by this. They didn't expect to be taking over the world, but suddenly they find that they are taking over the world. great debate gets going in Europe about why is it that we've abruptly gone from being terrified that the Turks are about to conquer us to finding ourselves taking over the rest of the planet. How do we explain this? And one of the theories that was most successful in the 18th century, when European gentlemen are scratching their heads saying, how do we get in this situation? One of the most popular theories is this one, that the ancient Greeks invented this unique civilization that not only makes Europe different from the rest of the world, but makes Europe better than the rest of the world. Modern Europe, 18th century Europe, has inherited this uniquely inventive, scientific, energetic culture from ancient Greece, spreads down through the Roman Empire, through the Renaissance to modern Europe, making its inheritors better than everybody else on the planet. And this explains what is now going on in the world. And you start to get characters like my own favourite, Johann Joachim Winckelmann, you see here, the grand old man of the study of ancient Greek art. You start getting some of the European scholars saying, well, we can compare what we know about Greek antiquity with what we know about certain other kinds of antiquity. Egyptian antiquity was the one he liked to compare the Greeks with. And we can use this to show just why the ancient Greeks were so much better than everybody else. Okay? This is a very valid thing to do. Although, it's now, I don't know how many of you actually read Winckelmann. I didn't read any Winckelmann until about 20 years ago. This is interesting. But when you read Winckelmann, you see the sort of thing that Edward Said made famous in his book on Orientalism, now almost 30 years old. That on the whole, when the 18th and 19th century Orientalists do compare Greco-Roman antiquity with other antiquities from different parts of the world, they tend to do so really more to illustrate a theory about the superiority of the Greeks and Romans than to actually test the theory against evidence from other civilizations. When Europeans and their overseas colonists, particularly in North America, start setting up the first modern research university in the 19th century, they tend to put Greco-Roman antiquity at the centre of the humanities. They tended to arrange the antiquities, the classical traditions of other parts of the world, particularly the Asian world, kind of arrange them around this Greco-Roman core in a sort of peripheral satellite positions. And often the thinking behind it does seem very much to have been to make people see the grandness, the greatness of European Greco-Roman antiquity. Now, there were good reasons why, when Europeans start setting up their research universities, why they do it in this way, why they put the Greco-Roman antiquity so much at the centre of what's going on. Now, for one thing, 18th and even 19th century European scholars, on the whole, really knew very little about the classical ages of other world civilizations. They knew a lot about Greeks and Romans, very little about other people. So it's not surprising they put such emphasis on Greece and Rome. For another thing, studying classical traditions, this, as many of you will know, this is really hard work. If you want to be good at Greek and Latin, you've got to spend years and years learning Greek and Latin. Usually, after spending all this time learning Greek and Latin, the last thing you want to do is go off and start learning classical Chinese or any other Old Persian or any other of the languages you would need to really do comparative study of different ancient traditions. There are a lot of good reasons for European intellectuals to conclude you don't really need to do this kind of comparative study. Knowing the linguistic skills for one region of the world, that is plenty. So we have very good reasons to reach that conclusion. I think another good reason why there's tended to be relatively little comparative study of the classical traditions of different parts of the world is that European scholars of Greece and Rome were set up right at the beginning of the modern universities to be numerically dominant over scholars of the classical traditions of other parts of the world, which built in an incentive not to rock the boat. If you are a professional studying ancient Greece and Rome, there's a lot of good reasons to want to keep, or maybe not consciously, but a lot of rewards come to those of us who specialize in these areas from not trying to disturb the balance too much. There's a lot of good reasons for contemporary classicists are able to profit from the institutional arrangements set up back in the 19th century. Now, just an example of this, take Stanford University, the fine people who pay my salary. By my count at Stanford, we've got 27 full-time people on the faculty whose primary focus in research is the archaeology or history of different bits of the world before the years roughly around AD 600, which for the moment I'll just say that's what we mean by ancient. Now, of these, of these 27 people, let us have some graphs and charts. We've got several minutes without any getting a little antsy. Let's have a graph and a chart. Of these 27 people, 22 of them, we're looking at the pie chart down here now, 22 of them study primarily the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean is the blue bit, everything else on the planet is the red bit. Of the 27 of us studying the world before the year 600, 19 of us, we're over here now, 70% of us study primarily ancient Greece and Rome. 30% of us study everything else on the planet combined. Stanford University appears to be saying that ancient Greece and Rome are twice as important as everything else in the ancient world combined. Now, Cambridge University, where I did my PhD, you see, it's all about me. Where I did my PhD, Cambridge, you will not be surprised to hear, makes it almost impossible from their website to figure out what the numbers are. So I don't have any pie charts for Cambridge. But I do have pie charts for Birmingham University, where I was an undergraduate. Birmingham employs 29 full-time folks studying the ancient world, of whom 22% of the 29, 76%, focus on the ancient Mediterranean, which apparently is 3 times as important as the rest of the planet. At Birmingham, 15 study Greece and Rome primarily, the blue bit here. 14 study the rest of the world. Birmingham thinks Greece and Rome is as important as the rest of the ancient world combined. Now, in my incompetence, I forgot to produce the pie charts for UCL. Finally, I'm glad to be here today. So I'll just have to give you some numbers instead. UCL is a little bit different, largely, of course, because of this enormous Institute of Archaeology you've got here. So the numbers at UCL are much, much bigger. By my count, you've got 66 people who study the ancient world as their primary focus. Of the 66, 37, so 56% are ancient Mediterranean. So actually this pie chart is actually pretty good. If you say that's Mediterranean, that's the rest of the world. The classicists, the Greco-Roman people at UCL, that is, what is it? That's 23 people at UCL, 35% of the whole. So UCL says ancient Greece and Rome is roughly half as important as the whole of the rest of the world combined. Overall, academics appear to be saying that ancient Greece and Rome is somewhere between half as important as everything else put together and twice as important as everything else put together. Now, this is something I suspect that if you stop the average professor of Greco-Roman classics and ask them, do you believe this to be true? Very few of them will say, yes, Greece and Rome are twice as important as everything else on the planet combined. And yet, I don't see a whole lot of signs of people attempting to change this balance in any way. And I think that this is a sort of institutional arrangement that is very convenient for the people who study ancient Greece and Rome. Now, of course, it's always possible, it's correct, maybe this is true, maybe Greece and Rome are twice as important as everything else combined, as my colleagues at Stanford seem to think. And certainly this arrangement of resources, this was all perfectly okay, so long as people did agree that ancient Greece and Rome were, say, roughly equally important as everything else in the planet combined. The problem with this sort of distribution, though, is that as the 20th century went on, the attitudes behind it came under increasing pressure in educated circles. More and more people started to say, we don't actually think that Greece and Rome are as important as everything else that happened in the whole of the world before 600 BC. And it came under increasing pressure, particularly from the social sciences. Increasingly, as people study human evolution, the evolved biological unity of humanity became increasingly clear, making it rather more difficult to stick to some of the old assumptions about the importance of Greece and Rome. Social scientists started advancing different interpretations of the shape of world history, how we got to be how the world got to be the way that it is. And so just a couple of quick examples of this. I'm sure you'll all have your own favourites. But say one book which I read when I was a graduate student, had a huge impact on me. Morton Fried's book, The Evolution of Political Society. I'm sure some of the more grey-haired among us will remember this book fondly. This was published back in 1967. Fried was telling the story of the rise of complex society from bands to states. Greece and Rome each showed up on 3 pages out of the 242 pages in the book. Morton Fried was saying that to understand the political evolution of humanity, you don't need to know anything really about Greece and Rome. Another more recent book, very influential book, David Christian's book, Maps of Time, the kind of founding monument of the modern big history movement. In that book, Greece and Rome each show up on 16 of the pages, but the book has 491 pages, so 16 of the pages is really not very much at all. David Christian also agrees to understand the history of the world, you need to know next to nothing about ancient Greece and Rome in particular. In US high school education, an article I mentioned down at the bottom here, it's a really good article. In US high school education, it used to be that all high schoolers spent at least a year of their mandatory social studies that you take in high school, at least a year studying Greece and Rome. Now Greece and Rome has been made one of several options you can study when you're looking at pre-modern civilizations. You might spend a year looking at Greece and Rome, but most students don't do that. It's become one among many interchangeable options for studying pre-modern agrarian civilizations. It's been sort of pushed increasingly to the margins outside the institutional arrangements of the modern university. But probably the bluntest statement of it, my favourite statement of the increasing sense that you don't need to be spending a lot of time worrying about this, comes from a geographer and historian named Al Crosby, who wrote a wonderful book that some of you I'm sure will know, called Ecological Imperialism. And I'm singling Crosby out because I think his book is so good, not because I think it's a terrible book. But Crosby at one point announces in his book, he says, between that era when the first states appeared and the time of development of the societies that sent Columbus and other voyagers across the oceans, roughly 4,000 years passed, I can't type, that's what I say passed, during which little of importance happened. So that is not just the Greeks and Romans, that is all of ancient history summed up for you right there. Little of importance happened. So, okay, how are we then to think about global antiquity? This is basically what I want to talk about today. To keep things manageable, what I want to do the rest of my time is kind of simplify the issue down to suggesting sort of 3 broad models of how we might think about global antiquity, and then talk about how they stack up against some actual evidence. So 3 broad models. One of them, what I'm going to call the standard model, is that this old idea that there's a unique Greco-Roman culture that transformed world history and sort of has driven the whole story since. The second model, we're going to call the global model. Greece and Rome, just fairly typical agrarian civilizations. Nothing special about them. You can swap them around, study Greece and Rome, study Han China, study Mauryan India. It really doesn't matter much. All agrarian civilizations, basically the same. Then finally, the Crosby model. Nothing happened in the ancient world. This whole debate is completely pointless and boring because the whole subject is completely pointless and boring. So what I want to do is then talk about how these different ways of thinking about global antiquity stack up against what we think we now know. Now, it seems to me obvious that the only way you can evaluate these different theories is comparatively. To judge the first 2 arguments, we need to set what the Greeks and Romans did alongside what other societies did, and ask which of these, if either, is a better description of reality. To judge the Crosby model, we need to set what the ancients as a whole did alongside what societies managed before 2500 BC and since AD 1500, and ask is what Crosby's saying true? Nothing really happened in this ancient period. Now obviously comparisons of this kind, this is not the only thing ancient historians should be doing, not by any means. But it is one of the things ancient historians, I think, ought to be doing. It is receiving more attention than it used to, which gives me an opportunity to promote a book that came out last week, edited by one of my colleagues at Stanford University, Walter Scheiner's State Power in Ancient China and Rome. Really good book. More work, comparative work, is now being done. But I think there's still a very long way to go. Now, it's easy to make loose comparisons between different parts of the world, and these, I think, can be very informative. So just an example of the sort of thing I mean by loose comparisons between different parts of the world. If we look at the two ends of Eurasia, for instance, and compare those in ancient times, we do see some broadly similar changes going on, especially I think during the first millennium BC. In China, in this the band of complex societies of the old world, China, India, Iran, through to the Mediterranean, all across this zone in the first millennium BC, the population more than doubles basically across this zone, with variations, but it's going on all across this area. Everywhere, farming becomes more intensive across this region. Plough agriculture spreads, here we've got Greek and Chinese pictures, plough agriculture spreads to regions where it wasn't used before. More intensive use of manure and terracing comes in all across this region. Without this, of course, you couldn't have the population doubling. Irrigation techniques are getting improved everywhere and spreading. Water mills get invented and start being used on quite a large scale eventually. All kinds of changes going on in parallel across this region. Iron comes in all across this region during this period, beginning in the East Mediterranean, quickly spreading out from there. The East Mediterranean discovery of ironworking, that might actually have also been the source of Chinese iron. The oldest Chinese iron all comes from the northwest, from Xinjiang, making it quite possible it actually spread across the steppes from the Mediterranean to China. But whatever the sources of the spread of ironwork, by the late first millennium BC, all across the band of complex societies, iron is displacing bronze, going on absolutely all across this area. All kinds of developments like the use of coal and gas as new sources of energy. This is going on all across this area. Writing, all kinds of parallel developments again all across the area. At the western end, the Phoenician script comes into use, starts being spread across the Mediterranean in an adapted form by the Greeks. And here a slide I'm going to show you again a little bit later. Green, where the Greeks settled down around the Mediterranean. Brown, where the Phoenicians settled down, taking this new script with them. On the left, one of the oldest examples of the Greek version of this script. In China, text use expands enormously in a somewhat parallel sort of way. In India, something rather similar is happening by the middle of the first millennium BC. Coinage, independently invented in the Mediterranean and out in China. By the end of the first millennium BC, very widely used all across the zone of complex societies. Economic exchange is being monetized. Cities are booming all across the zone. At the beginning of the period, around 1000 BC, biggest city at the western end of Eurasia, probably Susa, maybe something like 25,000 people. Biggest city in East Asia, probably Chi, something like 35,000 people. By the end of the first millennium BC, biggest city in the west, the city of Rome, and here the famous Italian model of the city of Rome. City of Rome has something like 1 million people. In East Asia, city of Chang'an has something like 500,000 people. Again, very parallel sort of trends. Both ends of the landmass see parallel developments in warfare as well, a series of revolutions in military affairs. At the western end of Eurasia, by about 800 BC, cavalry is replacing chariots in Assyria. Here, I think this is one of the reliefs in the British Museum, I think. One of the local ones, I think, for you guys. By 800 BC, chariots beginning to replace, cavalry beginning to replace chariots. Iron coming in as a standard form of weapons for dense formations of infantry by about 700 BC, and here a very famous Greek representation of this. By the 3rd century BC, Carthage and Rome, mobilizing armies, hundreds of thousands of strong, are armed with iron weapons to fight against each other. Very similar story in East Asia as well, but on a slightly later timetable. Cavalry replacing chariots, and here the chariots from the first emperors too. Cavalry replacing chariots by about 400 BC. Mass armies being raised in the same period. And here again from the first emperors too. One of my favourite pictures, the former first family in the former first emperors too. Isn't that great? Except for the chilling possibility because the former first emperor is not coming back. The former first family, however, may not be former all that long. So anyway, mass infantry armies being raised, becoming the decisive battlefield arms, certainly by about 500, 400 BC. They are iron-armed again, as in Western Eurasia, by the 2nd century BC. Lots and lots of shared trends going on all across the band of complex societies in the old world. But the problem is, of course, just listing similarities, or for that matter, just listing differences, this can only get you so far. Because of that observation, it is a very subjective process, it only takes you so far, leaves a lot of the assumptions implicit. When I first started trying to think a bit more systematically about comparing Eastern and Western civilizations over the long term, in a book I published 5 years ago called Why the West Rules for Now, the first thing I did when I started trying to write this book was try to look for ways to do these comparisons that would force me to be more explicit about what I was doing, rather than just saying, well, look, this looks like that. A way to kind of make things a bit more explicit. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of how I went about doing that, largely because I subsequently published another book that Maria mentioned, which basically explains in mind-numbing detail, my captions are a bit insane on the writing, explains in mind-numbing detail the system I came up with for comparing Eastern and Western history. The book is basically a giant footnotes, which makes it one of the dullest books ever written. But I would be delighted to go on about it at great length after the talk, if anyone's foolish enough to ask me. But basically, it seemed to me that what we needed to do, if we wanted to do systematic comparisons of these different civilizational traditions over many, many centuries, you needed some way to make your assumptions explicit and get everybody talking about the same things. And I felt that the best way to do that was to do some kind of quantitative index of social development, a way that you could assign numbers to what you were looking at, which would then force you to be able to say, well, why am I assigning this number? People could challenge you on the assumptions you're making, and we would all be at least talking about the same things. Now, what I ended up measuring, this thing I came to call social development, what I basically meant by that was society's ability to get things done in the world, to master their physical and intellectual environments. And I felt if we can find some way to measure this, we can then compare social development across time and space and really start discussing seriously what it is we think is the same and different in different places and why we think that these places are similar or different. And now there's huge scope for technical debates, but I think we can put together the archaeological and textual and comparative evidence to produce a rough and ready index that allows you to do just what I'm talking about. And basically, if my captioning hadn't gone quite so peculiar, what I ended up doing was looking at different parts of the world and measuring 4 traits in East and West, which was energy capture per person, organization. For proxy for that, I use the size of cities in different regions. Those have disappeared under the picture of the book. Then information technology and war-making capacity, which I felt these are all things that we could roughly measure over long periods of time, and then compare the results in different places. Rather than sort of marching you through all the different stuff that I did with this, I want to just focus on the ancient period now and talk about what why I think this index is quite a useful tool if you want to think about global antiquity. What we got here is a graph comparing the social development scores of the eastern and western ends of Eurasia between roughly 1000 BC and AD 600, over the bottom axis here, which I think for a lot of people this is roughly what they tend to mean when they're talking about ancient. I'm going to come back to periodization at the end before I finish. So across the bottom we've got chronology, 1000 BC to AD 600. On the vertical axis we've got scores on the social development index that I developed. And the blue line represents the scores in the western part of the world, the red line represents the scores in the eastern part of the world. And how you define west and east, of course, are also an extremely important part of that. And again, I'm happy to talk about that at length if anybody wants to get onto that. Now, looking at this graph, I think the interesting thing about this graph for me is how it breaks down into these 2 chronological phases. With a long phase, basically the whole of the first millennium BC, when the blue western and red eastern line basically behave in a parallel pattern. social development is consistently rising both ends of Eurasia across this period. Now, in the early first millennium AD, social development is falling in parallel, both ends of Eurasia. And then it gets really interesting in the middle of the first millennium AD, when we see, for the first time since the end of the Ice Age, Eastern social development rising above Western social development. Now this, I think, if I've done all the sums right, I think this is a sort of interesting observation about the history of social development over these very large parts of the world. And it seems to me there are 4 parallel processes going on at the eastern and western ends of Eurasia, which largely explain why development behaves so similarly in the 2 places. And what I want to do is talk for a few minutes about this millennium-long period when we're seeing rising social development, both ends of Eurasia. And then a little bit about the period of the declining social development and the crossover of the eastern and western scores, going through these 4 processes that I think are driving the story along. So these are the 4 things I'm going to talk about. The first of them, what I call state restructuring. What I mean by that is that in the early first millennium BC, both ends of Eurasia are characterized by what we might want to call low-end states, very simple governmental forms. So thinking of things like the Assyrian Empire before the period the Assyriologists call the interval, starting in 783 BC, or Western Zhou dynasty China. And in both of these places, the government's basically run by having a king who derives a lot of his authority from being in some sense divinely appointed, having special access to a supernatural sphere. The kings get things done by appealing to powerful men, aristocrats, to do things for them. The major thing that kings do tends to be fighting wars against other kings. And so the way you do this when you're a king, you'll say, next week we're going to go and invade the neighbouring state, whatever that happens to be. We're going to steal all this stuff. And the way this is going to work is that you aristocrats are all going to go home, you're going to raise a bunch of guys off your enormous estates, and then you're going to bring your guys back here, and we're all going to go off together. You provide the guys, I provide the leadership, we all go off together, we beat up and plunder our neighbours. Then we get all this plunder, and we all share it between us. I get the best share because I'm the king, and the gods say I should have the best share. But you also get pretty great shares too. And then you share out some of your share with the guys you grew up with you and sort of pass it on down. And this is sort of how we get things done. And if you're the king, the system doesn't bring in all that much revenue to the king. But as a king, you don't need that much revenue. Because I'm not paying for these armies or anything else. You, the aristocracy, you're providing the armies. It all works really well for the king and the aristocracy, so long as we carry on winning our wars. And so long as we carry on getting enough plunder that I can give you the plunder you need so that you stay with a commitment to this system. And I am getting enough more than the rest of you that I can maintain my position of leadership within this arrangement. The minute something goes wrong with that arrangement, it all comes unstuck. Now, as the first millennium BC goes on, increasingly states move away from that kind of structure. And the guy who seems to be really the first one to dramatically move away from this structure is Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, 744 to 727 BC probably, when he reigns. And we don't know much about exactly what he did. But Tiglath-Pileser III seems to have broken away from this system of getting things done by asking the aristocracy to do it for him and then sharing the proceeds with them. He starts centralizing things on himself instead. He says, instead of you guys going off raising armies, which I will then lead and will plunder our neighbors, I'm going to kind of cut you out of the picture. I am going to raise armies loyal to me, and I'll pay them salaries to fight for me. I'm going to have a large bureaucracy to organize this, and I'll pay them salaries as well. Now the good news, the bad news is you are now cut out of the picture. The good news is I will pay you salaries to work for me. You will be salaried employees of the state, leading the armies, heading the bureaucracies, doing this stuff for me, and I will be paid. Now the bad news for the king is that this is really, really expensive, and a great deal of revenue now has to come in for this to be possible. The good news for the king is, of course, when we go and plunder somebody, I get to keep all the plunder. and I can use it to pay people to work for me. Because I'm paying lots of bureaucrats, I can move increasingly toward systematized taxation, reliable revenue flows, rather than just living off plunder. And all over the land of complex society, starting the 8th century in Assyria, happening certainly by the 6th century in China, by the 4th century in India, we see the states all moving in this very, very similar direction. All of them, the kings kind of sideline the aristocracy to some extent, form a direct relationship with the poor. Poorer people take on new obligations, providing military service for the state, paying taxes to the state, but also get new rights from the state, including most often rights in their own persons and rights to the land that they work. And in Greece and Rome, we see a rather peculiar version of this. The band of complex societies. In the Greeks and the Romans produce a rather peculiar version of this, which functionally works in a very similar way, but does it without having kings at all. Now, again, of course, there are huge differences between the rulers in these different places, but functionally their states are all moving in rather similar directions. Now, the second big process is what I call intellectual restructuring. This is a pretty old idea. Back in the 1940s, a German philosopher, Karl Jaspers, Jaspers noticed that there is this remarkable similarity in a lot of the new intellectual systems that get developed in the first millennium BC. And Jaspers suggested the big thing that was going on was a shift away from an older way of looking at the world as kind of a great chain of being, going from the poorest peasant in the field up to the aristocracy to a godlike ruler who has privileged access to the supernatural sphere. And as you go down the great chain, you depend more and more on the people above you to provide you with salvation, access to a supernatural world. You start getting a shift away from that during the first millennium BC, says Jaspers. Instead of the old view, in the first millennium BC, you get more and more thinkers suggesting that the individual is responsible for his or her own fates. The individual is capable of transcending the failures of what Jaspers liked to call the disenchanted world. This world is full of problems and pain and suffering. You transcend it not by relying on a godlike king to sacrifice for you, but by a process of self-fashioning of some kind, which allows you to rise above the problems of this world. Now, nobody would confuse Plato's Apology with Confucius's Analects, but Jaspers' point was that there were similar debates going on everywhere from the Mediterranean out to China during the first millennium BC. And these great thinkers all across this, so this is taken from an undergraduate world history textbook. The big brown splodges are the core areas of this new thought in the first millennium BC, where these new questions are being posed, but shared questions across this whole region, even though so far as we know, there's very little exchange of ideas between these regions. Thinkers are all moving in rather similar directions. All of them are asking, how do we transcend this world? If we can no longer rely on godlike kings to do this for us, how do we do it? And in each of these areas, you'll get some thinkers starting to say mysticism. Mysticism is the path to transcendence. So you get characters like Parmenides in Greece, or many of the Taoists out in China. Other thinkers will say, no, nothing to do with mysticism. Rationality, a sort of scientific thought, that's the way you transcend this world. So say Aristotle in the Greek world, many of the Confucians are out in China. Others will be very populist and say, no, the secret is among us the whole time. Ordinary people already know the answers. The wisdom of the masses will transcend the problems of this world. So people like Protagoras, or maybe Democritus in Greece, or Mozart out in China. Others go to the opposite extreme, saying, no, authoritarianism, a great, powerful, strong ruler is what we need. The will of the great ruler. That solves all the problems of the world. Thinking of the legalists out in China, say some strands of Plato's thought, perhaps, in the Greek world. Others still are very relativist, saying there are many answers. Each of us finds his or her own path. So say your big strands in Jainism or Taoism in Asia, the nomos part of the nomos physis debate in the Greek world, strikingly similar. Questions being posed and answers being found in these very, very different philosophical systems. Of course, the first millennium BC, the thinking of this period, this becomes the classics all across the zone of complex societies, everywhere we look. This is the age of the classics. Jaspers looked at this period and said that the first millennium BC, he said, this is the axial age of history. And what he meant by that, he said, it's the axis around which the history of the world turned. Now, Jaspers was very vague on causes, but seems to me that when we look at the social development index, when societies start hitting a level around 25 points, they seem to start having an axial revolution. This is what I think happens all across the old world when the societies roughly hit 25 points on the index. Now, the axial age founding fathers, interestingly, they don't come from the great centres of wealth and power, from the middle of the centre of the Roman Empire, stuff like this. They tend to be rather marginal people, coming from rather marginal places, kingdoms like Lu in China, Sakya in India, Israel, Greece, places that are kind of on the edges of the great centres of wealth and power. They tend not to come from the rich elites as well. They tend to be people from the lower ends of the elites. And all across the band of complex societies, initially the axial age thinkers very much challenge the power structures. But then, as the first millennium BC goes on, increasingly these thinkers are co-opted by the leaders of these societies. The Confucians get turned into the bureaucracy in China. Ashoka in India finds a way to develop a very strange personal version of Buddhism which subordinates itself to the Mauryan Empire. Out in the Roman Empire, the Roman elite managed to co-opt Platonism, Stoicism, even Christianity eventually. Finally, you get to characters like Marcus Aurelius, able to spend all day fighting the Germans, then all night writing the Meditations back in his tent, fusing together the intellectual challenge and the great state restructuring that's going on at the same time. Now, the third big process going on is a geographical expansion of the core regions in this period. And this is something I've been particularly interested in my own research. It's something we see going on all the way from China to the Mediterranean. The first millennium BC sees an expansion from cities to states to great empires, sometimes a million plus square kilometers. Here just a quick chart of the size of the political units being created during the first millennium BC. Enormous expansion of them goes on. This is something, like I say, I've been very interested in myself. I spent several years trying to get a better sense of the geographical expansion of the core area at the western end of Eurasia by excavating a little village site in Sicily, the western end of Sicily, a place called Montepolzo. Here you see the beginning of our excavation here, more toward the end of the excavation. Excavating an indigenous Sicilian village site there to see what happens to these people when the Greeks and the Phoenicians come out as colonists, settle down around the coasts in this map again, take over the coastal lands. What happens to the native communities? The great debate got going about this back in the 1990s, saying, well, as this process of Mediterraneanization goes on, and local communities are getting sucked into broader flows of Hellenization and Phoenicianization. Here are some of the goodies from different parts of the Mediterranean that are showing up on our own site in Sicily. What happens to these people? What is the process of Hellenization or Phoenicianization? Well, what I realized as my excavation went on was that this was actually not the most important question that was going on here. Hellenization, Phoenicianization, these were really just local versions of a broader trend we see all across this zone of complex societies, of the expansion of core regions and are swallowing up the areas around them, being drawn into much bigger geographical units. And what's going on in the Mediterranean in the first millennium BC, it's really not that different from what's happening, say, in southern China or southern India. In many ways, not that different from, say, what happens in Mesopotamia during the Uruk expansion back in the 4th millennium BC. We're seeing the same kinds of processes being repeated over and over as core areas expand and swallow up the societies around them. Okay, the last of the big processes, economic growth. particularly what economists like to call intensive growth, rising per capita consumption in ancient societies. Now this is something that's been debated particularly hotly by Mediterranean historians, because for many, many years among Mediterraneanists it was considered totally taboo to talk about economic growth in the ancient world. As many of you know, this was the influence of the great Cambridge ancient historian Moses Finley, who developed this very compelling picture of the ancient Mediterranean world, which said that talking about economic growth in ancient times was simply wrong. It was an inappropriate concept to deploy in the ancient world. Now, the field has changed very dramatically in the last 50 years, and now increasingly people are starting to say that Finley, for all his great contributions to the field, was simply wrong when he said there was no such thing as economic growth in the ancient world. By the calculations I did for myself when I got interested in this question, it seems to me that in the Greek world between 800 and 300 BC, per capita material consumption actually increased by about 50%. People are becoming materially about 50% better off across a 500-year period, even though the size of the Greek population grew roughly tenfold across that same period. Now, when with a couple of my colleagues, I edited a book, the Cambridge Economic History of the Greco-Roman World, came out back in 2007, trying to advance this thesis. We tried to persuade Cambridge to call it the Stanford Economic History, because all three of us were actually at Stanford University. But Cambridge University Press has remarkably little sense of humour, we learned about this. When we published this book back in 2007, a lot of people thought we were just being ridiculous to suggest that the ancient first millennium BC Mediterranean was the biggest known example in history of sustained economic growth before the Industrial Revolution. Now I'm delighted to say that this is increasingly becoming a mainstream view. This was a remarkable period of economic growth. Now, the data are less well quantified in other parts of the band of complex societies. But increasingly, I think the evidence is becoming clear that something similar, but on a slightly smaller scale, was going on all across the zone of complex societies during this period. Now, this is something I've studied most just in the Mediterranean basin and in China. But the moment I'm trying to put together some data on India as well, with the help of a graduate student of mine at Stanford named Kate Crandler. And the Indian data again seem to be pointing in a very similar direction. That the first millennium BC sees this remarkable economic efflorescence in the old world. That during the first millennium BC, average growth rates, the aggregate growth of the economy was something like 0.1% per annum. Which sounds pretty trivial when you think of what's been happening in East Asia recently, 7 to 10% per annum. But there had never been anything like 0.1% per annum in any earlier period in world history. And in some places, like the Greek world, for 500 years, it's closer to 0.5% per annum aggregate economic growth. Absolutely unparalleled in earlier history. Okay, so there are all kinds of things that I was wanting to say, but I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to start bringing this toward a conclusion. So I've been talking about the first millennium BC, this parallel period of rising social development all across the band of complex societies. I want to say just a few words about the early first millennium AD, where we see falling social development in parallel both ends of the old world, and then a remarkable change in the middle of the first millennium AD, when Eastern social development overtakes Western social development. Once again, in the early first millennium AD, when we start seeing the development scores falling, we see a remarkable parallelism in the four processes going on all across Eurasia: state restructuring, intellectual restructuring, geographical expansion, or now contraction, economic growth, or now again contraction. We see the collapse of the Roman and Han dynasties, the big ones that collapse. But also in the 3rd century AD, the Kushan Empire in India begins unraveling. In the 5th century, the Sasanian Empire in Iran almost goes the same way. Very similar patterns all across the regions. In the first millennium BC, rising social development had fueled an intellectual restructuring. In the first millennium AD, falling social development again fuels parallel intellectual restructurings. We see new interpretations of axial age thought. Christianity and eventually Islam in the western end of Eurasia, Mahayana Buddhism in particular in the east end of Eurasia. And in their different ways, all of them offer new ways to think about the world, which is no longer the world of the first millennium BC. We see the economic boom of the first millennium BC beginning to come to an end in the first millennium AD, economic growth leveling off and probably declining as we go from the 2nd to the 3rd to the 4th centuries AD, probably all across the zone of complex societies in Eurasia. And since the 1970s, a lot of late antique historians at the western end of Eurasia have become very unwilling to talk about what they see as old-fashioned decline and fall models of the early first millennium AD. They've been pointing out quite rightly that the intellectual transformations that go on in the early first millennium AD, the late antique world in western Eurasia, these are remarkable things of great subtlety and complexity, well worth study in their own right. And they, of course, are absolutely right to point that out. And yet, at the same time, we see really unambiguous evidence that lifespans are getting shorter, the world is becoming a more violent place, and living standards are declining. Which I must say, to me, sounds very much like a decline and fall narrative. So, okay, the last thing I'll say something about that is not just the parallel decline in social development and all kinds of other things across the band of complex societies in Eurasia in the early first millennium AD, but also this great switchover we see happening between the East and the West in terms of their highest levels of social development. Ever since the end of the Ice Age, social development has always been higher at the western end of Eurasia than it is at the eastern end of Eurasia. That changes in the middle of the first millennium AD. This, I would say, is the most important thing happening over the right-hand side of this graph. The reasons for it seem to be fairly clear as well. In the 6th century AD, you see the reunification of China by the Sui dynasty. And the Tang dynasty in the 7th century goes on to have an extraordinary takeoff in China. You get the first East Asian cities with 1 million people in them. Extraordinary boom. It's kind of the golden age of pre-modern Chinese civilization in many, many ways. The reunification of China by the Sui dynasty allows Chinese governments to link the great cities of the north with the great expanding rice frontier in the south, moving food and people around, setting up this new efflorescence in East Asia. Nothing like that happens in Western Eurasia. You get attempts to reunite the Mediterranean basin in the 6th century, the Justinian's wars, which of course fail. The North and South Mediterranean remain very, very separate places. To some extent, the Arab conquests in the 7th and 8th centuries create a different kind of unified zone in Western Eurasia. And after the Arab conquests, Western Eurasian social development begins rising again. But it always remains much more sluggish than in Eastern Eurasia. And for the next 1,200 years, the highest social development levels in the world are at the eastern end of Eurasia. Now, a lot more could be said about this, but I'm going to stop. I think I'm going on much too long as this, so I'll stop there. A lot more could be said about this, but I think looking at this pattern that we see here, the pattern I think has some serious implications for the three models that I set out at the beginning of the talk for thinking about global antiquity. The parallelism between what's going on in different parts of the world. To me, the parallelism makes it very hard to remain strongly committed to the old standard model, saying that what happened in Greece and Rome, this is as important as everything else that happened in the rest of the ancient world, or even twice as important, the way we say at Stanford. The parallelism suggests that it's simply not true. And that the standard model is a very misleading way to look at the ancient world. That there is a big-scale story going on here. There is a global aspect to ancient history. We can't just continue with the standard model. The graph also, though, I think, suggests that what I was calling the global model, the idea that Greco-Roman civilization is just interchangeable with other ancient civilizations. They're all basically the same. This, I think, is not true. You look at this graph, And it's immediately apparent that the blue line through most of the periods that we tend to think of the ancient periods, the blue line is always much higher than the red line. There was something special about Greco-Roman antiquity, and we should be debating what it was that was special about Greco-Roman antiquity. Why is it that the development scores are so much higher in ancient times at the western end of Eurasia than anywhere else in the world? The third theory, the Crosby model, nothing happened in ancient history. It's really totally uninteresting. This, I think, is also clearly wrong. When you look at this graph, I think it's impossible to say nothing is happening during this period. Something very, very substantial is happening. Crosby said, if you look at the period between 2500 BC and AD 1500, when Columbus and the other voyagers go out across the oceans, basically nothing happens. And yet, if you compare this graph with social development in more recent periods, what you find is that in the period when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Western social development is significantly higher than it's going to be in the period when Columbus crosses the Atlantic. To say that nothing happened in the ancient world is just misleading. So it seems to me that none of the traditional ways of thinking about ancient history are very helpful to us. I think what I would now say, if I got the memo from the dean again, saying, what are you guys doing to forward the global study of the world in classical scholarship? Now I think I probably wouldn't know what to say in response to his memo. The first thing I would do, because that dean really loved graphs, the first thing I send him this graph, say, look, something really big is happening, it's on a global scale, this is all incredibly important, you should give us a lot more money. So I'd send him this graph first. Then what I would do, because that dean, the one thing he loved more than graphs was memos with bullet points on them. So I sent him a memo with 4 bullet points on them. I would say, well, first, the first bullet point, there is indeed a global antiquity out there that needs to be studied, and people are beginning to study it. There's a global antiquity. If we don't understand that global antiquity, we are never going to understand the shape of the world that we live in. So there is a global antiquity out there. The old ways of looking at the world as multiple separate ancient worlds, this needs to be replaced with a single global vision of the ancient world and how different regions fit together. So that would be the first of my bullet points. The second of the bullet points, I'd say this isn't a plea for a kind of democracy of cultures vision, a way that a lot of people in the humanities were suggesting we should have back in the 1990s. It's not a plea for a democracy of cultures vision. Some parts of the world are more important than other parts of the world in this story, and we should treat them accordingly. We should not try to treat every part of the world equally. Third bullet point on my memo would be that the single most important part of the ancient world was the western end of Eurasia, where, going right back to the end of the Ice Age, this was the region where social development was consistently higher than in any other part of the world until about the year AD 550. This part of the world does deserve special emphasis, does deserve special study. But having said that, while the champions of Greco-Roman classical studies, I think, do have a valid point about the importance of their field, so too do the critics who insist that we can only understand Greece and Rome when we put it in a larger global context. Putting 2/3 of the resources into the study of Greece and Rome, which is what we do at Stanford, this makes it very difficult to put Greco-Roman civilization into a broader context. Maybe putting 1/3 into Greece and Rome, the way you do here at UCL, maybe that's actually a better balance. And that, of course, would be a very hard thing for the chair of a classics department to say. Except, of course, I would then immediately follow it up by saying the obvious way to do this is to spend vastly more on the study of the ancient world, so we can hugely increase the size of the resources going to the other regions. The fourth point I would make in my bullet points in my memo would be that while I think Al Crosby was flat wrong to say that nothing interesting happened in ancient times, I also think that he can be forgiven for reaching that conclusion. Ancient historians, unlike prehistorians, have very rarely tried to tell a global story. So that when a geographer like Al Crosby looks at the ancient world, he can't see anything very important going on there. When social scientists look at the ancient world, they often come to the conclusion nothing very important happened there. When deans deciding how much resources to put into different fields look at the ancient world, they often decide similarly, this is not a very important field. When employers deciding whether to hire our students look at the field they study, they often also decide this is not a very important field. A lot of people think that ancient history simply isn't very useful because we've done such a dreadful job of presenting a larger scale global story about it. But that conclusion, that the ancient world is not a useful field to study, that conclusion I think is dead wrong. Nobody can understand how our world got to be the way it is unless you first understand global antiquity. And that will be the end of my memo. So thank you very much for listening.
Right, well, I'm somewhat wrong-footed by the complete excision of anything to do with Africa from this talk, unlike the paper which I read, including mentions of the fact that Africa was without empires until the colonial era in the 1850s, was rather slow on domestication, slow on urbanism, slow on various technological developments. You just have to bear with me that that was there, and that is what I'm responding to. Now, I'm going to try, because my eyesight is not so good, to put this down here. I myself am one of UCL's 37 Africanists, and one of 5 who work on Africa's pre-colonial past. I also teach the Institute of Archaeology's first year undergraduate course, World Archaeology, in which Africa is accorded a rather different role to the one it was given in tonight's lecture. In truth, I feel a bit like a respondent to the famous 2007 speech of Nicolas Sarkozy in Dakar, Senegal, a political speech based on Africa as a timeless society of basic agriculture and little historic narrative, certainly little importance to the big picture. This speech almost instantly provoked an edited volume, which I translate from the French as Short Remedial Summary of African History for the use of President Sarkozy. The contributors had 348 pages to work with. I have less than 10 minutes, so please bear with me. To begin, and again this is going on the original talk, I was surprised to find that I spent the bulk of my career working on something that doesn't exist. That is to say, pre-colonial African empires. Yet mine is not a maverick view. One can read about African empires at length in Maurice Delafosse's monumental 3-volume Haute Sénégal Niger, which came out back in 1912. Or in a litany of other works since, the most recent being my own 7,000-word summary on the subject in the Oxford Handbook of African Archaeology, which came out just last year. A great deal of hard fieldwork has gone into developing our understanding of Africa's past since the 1970s. It seems that much of the outside world has not yet caught up with this literature. Africa is still seen by some as being at the bottom of the historic global league table, waiting around in stasis, easy pickings for the colonial scramble. But it is probably only at the time of the said scramble that Africa was sufficiently disorganized and the West sufficiently geared up for the colonial wave to stand any real chance of success. Cannon and other firearms were needed to even the odds, and substantial West African polities had to be disrupted by the European acceleration of internal slave raiding instability and civil war in the 18th century. But first, to rewind a bit, Africa was one of the 3 great world innovators in the development of ceramic technology, and pottery spread from the Niger River to the Nile Valley by around 9,500 BP, and interestingly enough, it started, it seems, at least on the basis of current radiocarbon dates, from the Niger Valley rather than the Nile. Depending on your perspective, Africa may or may not have been the author of a 3rd event of cattle domestication in what is now the Egyptian and Libyan Sahara between 9,500 and 8,000 BP. Regardless, cattle were in West Africa by at least 6,500 BP. Cereal domestication, on the other hand, was rather later in West Africa, at 4,500 years before present. Sufficient wild grain made that needless, showing that one cannot always trust the old models generated in Western Asia. Iron metallurgy began in 800 BC across most of West and Central Africa. It may well have been earlier. 1000 BC seems possible. There are many disputed radiocarbon dates. Regardless, in its time, Africa was on the cutting edge of technology, not waiting to play catch-up to Eurasia. Outside of the Nile Valley, there are early indicators of social complexity, particularly across the Tichet and Wallata escarpments of southern Mauritania, with a four-tiered settlement hierarchy of stone masonry towns dating from 1600 BC. The largest of these settlements, Dachet El Atrous, dates to at least 1100 BC, covers 80 hectares, and features many hundreds of stone burial monuments, which would not be out of place in, say, Kerma. It was, at the very least, a proto-urban locality, and what has been termed in the literature a complex chiefdom. But as with Cahokia in Illinois, it's all down to the definitions, where some see a chiefdom, others see a state. Urbanism with occupational specialists, public works, agricultural hinterlands, and long-distance travel stretching to the Mediterranean world begin along the Middle Niger in the first millennium BC at Dia, where I helped to coordinate a multinational research team in the late 1990s. Mike Rowlands was also part of that team. And certainly there was widespread urbanism in West Africa on a scale to rival Europe in terms of density of settlement and size of settlement between 400 and 1100 AD. Localities such as Djenné-Djenné, Gao, Tambuz, which is the predecessor of Timbuktu, and Ife, the subject of an important exhibition at the British Museum a couple of years ago, all come immediately to mind, and there are many, many more. Finally, there are the empires. The first textually attested one is Ghana, located in modern Mali and Mauritania, confusingly. Archaeological evidence places its origins around 400 AD, and it is textually recorded in Arabic by geographers from the 9th and 10th centuries. Al-Yaqubi, in his Tariq of AD 872, wrote, "Then there is the kingdom of Ghana, whose king is also very powerful. In his country are the gold mines, and under his authority are a number of other kings. Among them are the kings of Am and Sama." Then we have Ibn Hawqal, writing in AD 967, "Ghana is the wealthiest king on the face of the earth because of his treasures and stocks of gold." By the time of the region's next great empire, that of Mali in the 13th century, a sophisticated imperium ruling over more than a dozen client states, stretching from the West African coast to the Niger Bend, over a territory of 2,500,000 hectares, which I fancy will satisfy Professor Morris's definition of empire without breaking too much of a sweat. I could go on. But to close my brief tirade, there is a certain commonality in attempts to globalize and provide a rationale for world prehistory. Such accounts do not merely share the same width of geographic determinism. They let certain regions dictate a global rhythm and pay short shrift to acquiring an up-to-date knowledge of perceived marginal zones. In short, I don't think you'll find many Africanists who would recognize Jared Diamond's thumbnail sketch of the continent in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Perhaps this is one reason why I warn my students to be wary of grand syntheses, why I remain partial to the particularistic outlook of Franz Boas, and why I'm a big fan of Tim Pocketat's critique of social evolution, chiefdoms, and other archaeological delusions. One must always be certain to have a real grasp on more localized developments and their causality. I know that this is a great deal to demand of anyone. It is one reason why I'm quite happy to focus on deep-time West African political traditions. I only ask that grand synthesis take the time to earnestly consult with those of us who have consecrated our careers to areas outside of the Mediterranean. They may find that the rest of the world is a bit different than they think and does not conform without resistance to tidy global models.
Mine is going to be a very provocative response, but since I only have 10 minutes, I hope you'll bear with me if I read it out. Some years ago, Professor Morris encouraged us to consider the importance of using a sociological framework and the globalization analogy for the archaeology of the Mediterranean basin. He coined the term Mediterraneanization to this effect, pointing out that the value of doing so would bring to the fore the dynamism of tensions and conflicts of the ancient Mediterranean, and encouraged us to ask, and I use his words, the same tough questions that scholars ask about connectedness in our own time. Globalization, he said, has created winners and new losers. Mediterraneanization did the same. Winners and new losers indeed, Winners, those who benefit the most from espousing and pushing for globalization, and losers, those who are left behind and have to catch the train, whether the Euro train or the transatlantic trade and investment partnership train. But the gain or loss is not simply economic. It is also intellectual, and in being so, it is a highly political problem, which Anglophone academia does not politicize enough. The conceptual apparatus with which Professor Morris begins is based on the premise that the Victorian view of Greco-Roman antiquity is the European view. Clearly, this is not the case. Not all Europeans were conquering the world in the 18th century, and those who didn't were not only looked down upon by those who were. You only have to read the travel writing of 18th century grand tourists traveling to Italy and Greece, full of stereotypes and tropes of barbarian and violent people of the south who didn't quite fit the part of what their ancient civilized counterparts represented. They even slept in beds full of bugs. To Victorian and Northern European eyes, the exoticness of Southern Europe was closer to the world they were conquering than to the classical past. Those who didn't conquer the world also cannot be fit into what Professor Morris calls the standard model of 18th century European ideas in regards to antiquity. There is no standard model, but a hegemonic one. Those who didn't conquer the world, at least some of them, developed distinctly different and highly variegated views of the past, which were the product of local political debates and affiliations, which are of no interest to the English because they had little or nothing to say about contemporary colonialism. This is seen, for example, in southern Italy of the late 18th century, where we find a growing gap between the interests of foreign antiquarians and travelers and Italian antiquarians' ideas, as the book by Giovanna Cesarani, a colleague of Professor Morris, has demonstrated. Hence, Paestum, the ancient city in what is today modern Campania, south of Naples, rediscovered in the middle of the 18th century and regarded as the best example of Greek Doric architecture by the end of the 8th century, and by Winkelmann as an example of a stylistic progression towards the perfection of Periclean Athens, was deemed to be Etruscan in style and held in Oriental or Phoenician origins by the local antiquarian Mazzocchi, a view that Neapolitan antiquarians defended, but that was eventually eclipsed by Northern European scholarship. Why is this important to note? Does it matter? To me, it matters because our Anglophone focus on globalization in relation to antiquity, what Professor Morris calls a global antiquity, is a product of a reaction to that Victorian hegemonic model. There are, in other words, alternative models of thinking of a so-called Mediterranean antiquity. I say so-called because some of us would like to teach, especially at a graduate and doctoral level, the archaeology of the Mediterranean that is not necessarily focused on Greece and Rome. But this is sometimes a difficult task. Much of the literature is not in English, and on the whole, Anglophone universities consider students' learning of foreign languages as a box-ticking exercise at best. Hence, in several cases around the UK and the US, Mediterranean archaeology will be Greeks, Romans, and the others being the Phoenicians, rarely the Scythians, or the Etruscans, usefully Hellenized and Romanized, that is, put in a suitably classical straitjacket for the Victorian perspective, still alive and kicking today, despite decades spent digesting Said's Orientalism and post-colonial theory. Thinking of these 18th century alternative models of antiquity, as far as the Mediterranean is concerned, makes me wonder whether we have moved beyond those Victorian views as much as we think we have, and whether Professor Morris's proposition of a global antiquity is truly post-colonial. To me, it is not for a simple reason. Proposing the idea of a global antiquity is an act of globalizing ancient civilizations according to the hegemonic model itself. But the concept itself of antiquity and time is also culturally specific, even within the supposed post-axial age West. A good example of this comes from the late 14th and 15th century Florence, where temporality and antiquity were conceptualized in a non-linear way, especially in relation to artistic production on the one hand, and the dominant political ideologies of the city on the other. In regards to artistic production, Nagel and Wood have coined the ingenious phrase anachronic renaissance to indicate the ways in which works of art and artifacts, from paintings to churches to furniture, were seen to belong to the present or near present, but could be used as if they belonged to the past, allowing the artist to use or substitute an artifact and effectively render the artifact antique, even if it was not. Past and present collapsed in this so-called substitutive mode of artistic production, and artifacts had a double historicity, or unstable temporality, to use Nagel and Wood's words. The late 14th and 15th century was also the period in Florence where we see what I would call the political constitution of antiquity. Florentine collectors of arts, arts patrons, political philosophers, and discoverers of the classics were the early modern version of politicians. By that I mean that antiquity was a present-focused concept which constituted, and in turn was constituted by, the change in self-positioning of the city's ruling classes towards republican and monarchical value at a time when Florence was going through civic and military conflicts, both at home and abroad. Antiquity was a malleable temporal framework suitably adapted to Florence's political self-fashioning. The history and origins of the city were either Roman and hence republican, particularly in the late 14th century, or were more ancient than the Romans, namely Etruscan, by the early 15th. The antiquity of the city thus shifted as supple material in the hands of changing political ideologies, as did the political relevance of the Etruscans, either ruled by kings and therefore utterly ignored by historians and chroniclers, or born as free city-states and therefore worthy of entering antiquity itself. Renaissance Florence suggests, at least to me, that it is not possible to think of antiquity on a global scale, because temporality and antiquity are not only culturally specific, but also specific to the object, whether text, document, visual image, or artifact, through which time itself is conceptualized at a specific time and place. In the late 15th century, the entanglement of anachronic art production and the shift in political ideologies shaped by the antiquity of the day happened in a cultural atmosphere that was exposed to an increasingly archaeological, not just literary heritage. The potential that this example has for an in-depth understanding of diverse notions of antiquity is clear. But there is a more important reason to me why the idea of a global antiquity doesn't work. As a reaction to a very specific idea of antiquity derived from the English 18th century standard model, it is anything but global, quite the contrary. Thank you very much.
I promised Professor Morris that he would have an opportunity to be the first to reply to the responses. So I'll give Ian an opportunity to say a brief word now, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Switched on? I might have just switched it off. Is that
Martha, can you hear? Is that
Yeah, I can hear
I think it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, yeah, well, thank you to the two respondents. Fascinating comments. I should make my apologies to them as well, as they will know, and the rest of you won't. The comments I made here were a much truncated version of the paper that I sent to them. This always happens when starting a new project. I'm always convinced there's all these things that have to be said, and I'm always convinced I'm going to say them all in 50 minutes, and I never do. So my apologies to them that they found themselves responding to things that in the end got chopped off. But I thought they made very interesting responses anyway, although I disagree completely, of of course. Professor MacDonald's suggestion, that knowing a lot of stuff about Africa suggests to him that we should be wary of global syntheses. I mean, to be honest, I think it suggests exactly the opposite from that. It's the detailed knowledge of one region always makes me feel that I got to know more about the bigger picture in order to have the context to put it in. And think about your remarks about empire and pre-modern empire in Africa. And obviously I'm no expert on African history and only to dabble in it a very little bit. It seems to me when I read things about pre-modern empires in Africa, it just seems to me Africanists are using the word empire in an entirely different way from people who study the empires of the first millennium BC in the old world. Seems to me that this is a good reason to engage more aggressively with global level syntheses and meta-narratives rather than say, oh, we don't want to deal with that, we're going to stay away from that. And certainly with the example you gave of 2.5 million square kilometres, that would certainly qualify, yes. So as always, I'm wrong on the details. But the conclusion I would draw that from this is still that engagement with the larger story is essential, not saying, oh, there are things about the area I'm an expert in that don't seem to fit very well with the broad brushstroke pictures that are presented, therefore we should not engage with them. That just seems to be a great mistake. And you poured scorn on Jared Diamond. Jared's a terrible thing, he's a wonderful man, and he barely needs me to defend him, but I'm going to do so anyway. I mean, I felt that one of the great things he did with Guns, Germs and Steel was to point out the history of complex societies around the world, and the sort of why certain parts of the world have become dominant really had very little to do with the specifics of the local cultures. It was driven almost entirely by the distribution of natural resources.
Which are often wrong.
Pardon?
The distribution of natural resources, at least for Africa, in Diamonds, Guns, Germs and Steel were incorrect.
But incorrect enough to falsify the general picture. I mean, as far as I know, you I'm sure will know a lot more about the radiocarbon dates than I do, but I'm not aware of people trying to push the origins of indigenous agriculture in Sahel back to the same kind of stage that we see in Southwest Asia. There seems to be a gap of thousands of years there. And Diamond's big point was...
It depends on whether you're talking about cattle or crops.
Diamond said, I mean, you mentioned the East Sahara oases, and Diamond said almost nothing about them. I think when he wrote Guns, Germs and Steel, he had no idea about the data from there. What he would now say, which he also applied to his own specialist area in New Guinea, is that to have an agricultural revolution that leads on to states and great empires, it's very difficult to do that on the basis of just plants or animals. You have to have both together. And that's why New Guinea has one of the earliest plant-based agricultural revolutions, but doesn't go on to develop indigenous states and empires. That's why we don't see indigenous states and empires appearing in the Eastern Sahara. But again, obviously, people can always argue over the details.
Kerma, for example.
So Ghana?
Kerma.
Okay. Okay. We can argue over details. I have not been convinced that the Africanists have done anything to disrupt the picture that the chronology of agricultural revolutions are driven by the distribution of resources. That the reason the sub-Saharan African agricultural revolutions happened chronologically so much later than the ones in Southwest Asia, Southeast and East Asia has nothing to do with failings of African culture, the way a lot of people suggested over the years. It's simply because the resources weren't there to allow for early agricultural revolutions. Once an agricultural revolution did begin south of the Sahara, African societies seem to develop along roughly the same kind of timetable as they do in other parts of the world. It's just that the timetable begins so much earlier in other parts of the world. And that's why you consistently get groups of people from Asia and Europe pushing into the coasts of Africa, and then the 19th century when they have the ability to do so into the interior, rather than Africans pushing out so much, sub-Saharan Africans pushing out into other places. But again, we can argue a lot over the details, but it seemed, I just felt that everything you said encouraged more engagement with the global narrative, not less. And in Dr. Lever's comments, again, fascinating set of comments. But one thing that particularly struck me in what you were saying was this suggestion that these globalizing view of the world is, at least in part, like a reaction against these Victorian narratives, intent to put something else, something different in their place, which you think isn't going very successfully, but a reaction against the existing narratives. And this, I would say, I think is one of the most interesting things about trying to change scales of analysis and also to topics of analysis. And yeah, I mentioned this book, The Cambridge Economic History of the Greco-Roman World, with some of us edited a few years ago. When we started working on this, the big thing we were trying to suggest is, unlike the Finlay view of the ancient world, as we saw it, there's just abundant evidence for massive economic growth by pre-modern standards in the ancient Mediterranean, including economic growth that went really much of the way down the social ladder, so that tens of millions of people saw their living standards raised substantially across the first millennium BC. This is one of the very earliest examples where we can point to something like that happening. It also struck us that when we started thinking about these problems, that maybe it was not a coincidence that a number of ancient historians were starting to say that large-scale patterns of exchange and interaction and rising per capita levels of consumption were a big part of ancient history. Maybe it's no coincidence this had really taken off since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. That during the Cold War, models that saw the ancient world as fragmented and sort of different areas broken off from each other, very inward turned. These models just seem to make a lot of sense to people. Once the Berlin Wall came down, people started saying, oh, these are not satisfactory models anymore. We want to replace them with models in which process is much more like those we seem to see happening in our own world. These sorts of globalizing processes, we want to put in models which pay more attention to these sort of globalizing processes. And because if that's true, I think it largely is true, then that would suggest that the kind of shift we were trying to make in the Cambridge economic history was a very ideological shift. It's driven by presentist events, presentist concerns. But then it also struck us, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. I mean, very little of the best scholarship in history that I would say has ever not been driven by presentist concerns. We say there are things happening in the world around us which make certain things about earlier periods interesting. And I think this is almost true by definition. If the things happening in the world around you are things, a better way to put it, if the things you're interested in the ancient world are not ones that resonate with the world around you, people are not going to find them interesting. And I think that has been the big problem with a lot of the fragmented histories of the ancient world in the last 50 years. The fact that you are driven to look at the things in the ancient world which do seem interesting in other context doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong to do so. It doesn't necessarily mean that the patterns you find are false ones, just because the initial questions are driven by presentist concerns. I think the big failing is when we start to let our answers to those questions be driven by present concerns, not when we start asking questions which seem to us to be interesting in the world that we ourselves live in. So, I mean, I guess I agree with a lot of things that you're saying, but again, like what I'm saying about the first set of responses, draw the opposite set of conclusions from.
Can I just say, I know Corinna and Karen are desperate to respond back, but I think in this context, we're aware that there is going to be a workshop tomorrow in which we're going to continue to have these detailed debates, and I think at this moment, I would just like to take the opportunity to open it up to others in the audience who might like to ask a few questions, and then we will go back to these debates again tomorrow. So can I ask if anyone here would also like to ask a question? Otherwise, Corinna's going to answer.
I wanted to ask, in terms of your global ancient civilization, how interconnected you see it as being. So to what extent are they simply things which are happening along parallel tracks? To what extent is it part of the same railway system? And particularly thinking about the synchronisms and the synchronism of the turn down during the first part of the first millennium AD, because presumably it's not a question of some kind of plateau or ceiling being reached, because China would have had a long way to go. So could you tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I see two stories going on simultaneously in this attempt to think about ancient history at the global level. And one is the local story, or local stories, where, like I was suggesting a moment ago, we get this series of agricultural revolutions beginning at various points after the end of the last ice age, driven, it seems to me, very much by the density of resources available in different regions. So the place with the greatest density in Southwest Asia has the first agricultural revolution beginning about 9500 BC, begin over the following millennia. And then, I think, at least at a certain level of abstraction, you can look at each region as following a rather similar timetable. If you've got plants and animals that can be domesticated, typically it takes about 2,000 years from the first signs of cultivation, people producing plants with bigger than natural seeds. It takes about 2,000 years to get to full-blown domestication, where people are intervening in the genomes of plants and animals enough to create domesticated species that can only continue reproducing with more human intervention, which generally leads to major increases in the amount of food available and the size of the population. Then it typically takes about 4,000 more years to go from full domestication to the rise of governments, cities, states, writing, all these kinds of things. Then in some places, another couple thousand years would get you to empires where you've got 2 million plus square kilometers. And I think to a great extent, Africa does sort of fit this timetable quite well. And then other places still, another couple thousand, 2,500 years will get you to an industrial revolution. And so you've got these local traditions sort of going on in parallel, and different parts of the world look different at each point in time because they start down these paths at different points. But then other places, like say Siberia or something, you just can't have an agricultural revolution in Siberia. You don't start down the path. But then as you go down the path, and social development is rising, you're getting the geographical expansion, the paths start to bump into each other. The further they go on, the more these core areas are expanding out. And so, like say, certainly by the 2nd century AD, you're beginning to get some kind of tentative contacts all the way from the Mediterranean basin out to China. And it's not obvious that in the 2nd century it's initially having that much impact, but perhaps it does. I mean, there are people, I tend to think they're right, who suggest that the great pandemics we get in the Mediterranean and China starting in the 160s, maybe these are linked to the fusing of disease pools, creating new strands that nobody really has a good evolved response to. So maybe as early as the 2nd century AD, we're already seeing massive consequences of geographical expansion, so that these what had been separate paths previously are increasingly running into each other. And I think as we go on in the 2 millennia AD, increasingly the big story starts to become genuine globalization, the blurring of these tracks together. I mean, certainly by 15th, 16th century, this is becoming a major, major thing. And I mean, this is what is a historiographical detail. I was talking to some people recently at Cambridge University Press about a new series, Cambridge History of the World, they're doing. And they wanted each volume to have every single chapter in the volume being a global chapter, not a sort of meanwhile in China chapter, and here's the meanwhile in Africa chapter. Every chapter should be about the whole world. And they have no trouble getting prehistorians to do this, and no trouble to get early modernists to it, but intense trouble getting ancient and medieval people to do it. And I think the big reason for that is that by the early modern period, we are really seeing genuine globalization happening as social development is rising, the tracks are blurring into each other. And so, yeah, I think that the stories, these two things happening at once, and kind of how they restructure the whole world across 5,000 years.
I think if we're going to get a few more questions in, Ian, you're going to have to shorten your answers. So, yes, at the back there.
You spoke about civilizations from opposite ends of Eurasia, kind of having like similar developments and collapses at the same time. Do you know if this is happening with like civilizations of the Americas as well?
I would say not really. I think that I've started recently to get very interested in New World stuff. It was dawned on me, what I think has been obvious to a lot of people for a very long time. The New and the Old Worlds, to a great extent, provide these kind of natural experiments. They really are cut off from each other through most of the period before AD 1500. And I think with the New World, we see similar rhythms, and I think we see it following. Again, it's an example of one of these tracks. You get independent agricultural revolutions in the New World, and they start off down this same sort of path toward more and more complex, larger-scale societies. But the evidence for actual connections between what's happening in the New World and the Old World, I think, is, with certain exceptions, I think is very small until AD 1500.
This may be somewhat related, but what factors changed which initiated these early agricultural revolutions?
So what factors change?
In the world or in terms of humanity?
Oh, when people have agricultural revolutions.
Exactly. Did it coincide with the advent of language, or I'm just interested if you could touch on that something?
Yeah, agricultural revolutions have very slow impacts. They play out across many, many centuries normally, but just massive impacts. And I think a number of them you can pick out as being the really big ones. In a sense, like the biggest one of them is the way that agriculture can release so much more energy per unit of land for human beings than a foraging lifestyle. And one thing humans can do with this is turn the extra energy, the extra food energy, into more of themselves. And without exception, this is one of the things people did. Populations absolutely explode. The size of the larger settlements goes up very, very dramatically once people begin to agricultural lifestyles become more and more sedentary. You can only move in that direction if you start developing more hierarchical, more complex societies. And again, we see this in pretty much every case we look at. So it sets up a series of social revolutions. Also, one of the things we see is that you can only have agricultural lifestyles. They can support much larger numbers of people, but one of the prices of that is much more work from the people themselves. And the amount of labour people do goes up enormously. They require much more complex divisions of labour, and those tend to be integrated through very, very hierarchical societies compared to foraging ones. So again, you get the first kings, you get the first real social oppression going on in agricultural societies. So I would say there's like three big things that have happened in history: the origin of modern humans, the agricultural revolution, and the industrial revolution. Those are basically, that's all you need to know about history. Once you know that, you've kind of got the big picture. The rest is just the details. But not everyone agrees.
Hello. Hello. I was just thinking of your colleague, I think it's your colleague, Mel Ferguson's work, The West and the Rest. And I was wondering whether you think that separate civilizations can still be said to exist in the modern world, which is so globalized.
Yeah, another great question. Neil, actually, I was going to say Neil's not my colleague. I suppose he sort of is. He has a part-time appointment at the Hoover Institution, Stanford. So yeah, he does show up occasionally. Do the separate civilizational strands still exist in the modern world? I guess I would say much less so than before. I mean, I think one of the big storylines in history has been how geography, I think, drives social development. And where you live in the world, that largely determines the way your life is through almost all of history. Geography drives social development. But at the same time, social development changes what geography means. And so different things become important at different points. And I think you can certainly make the case that this process of social development changing the meaning of geography, one of the big things in history has been the acceleration of this process. To the point that now, in the last couple of hundred years, in certain ways, development has reached levels that have begun to erode the significance of geography altogether. And because it doesn't affect every part of life, at least not so far. But say, to come here, I had to sit in little tin cans for like 12 hours flying from California to get here. And I complained endlessly about having to do this. But if I tried to come from California to here 100 years ago, I would have been bouncing on the back of wagons and sitting in trains and steamships and everything. This would have taken me months to do this. If I tried to do it 500 years ago, it would have been just about possible. 1,000 years ago, out of the question. Social development has significantly broken down the separateness of the world in the last few centuries. And there are ways in which you could say it's beginning to break down the meaning of separate regions altogether. I mean, there are increasing numbers of people in the world who live large parts of their life on a digital platform. I mean, I was sitting in my hotel room this morning doing email with people back well, actually not this afternoon, but people back in the US. And this is only a very small part of my life, but distance in that sense has begun to mean very, very little. And I think at the moment we're still living in a period where basically the richer you are, the less space means to you. There are some people for whom space has collapsed in a spectacular way in the last half century, whereas, say, if you're living in the Democratic Republic of Congo, geography still means a very great deal to you. But my guess would be one of the biggest things happening across the 21st century is going to be the accelerating collapse of the meaning of space. Possibly something that will affect everybody in the world, possibly something that its consequence will be that a small number of people pull away from the rest of us so spectacularly that everything we think we've learned about trends like democratization over the last 200 years may be reversed totally. So yeah, I think again you've raised one of these really big questions that potentially could change everything.
I think on that note, we should perhaps say that this is the moment, I think, to thank Ian Morris for the efforts he has put in today in holding up the concept of global antiquity to scrutiny. We're going to continue this debate tomorrow in the workshop that Hans is running from 1:30 in the Pearson Lecture Theatre. We are going to continue discussion more socially and relaxed, I hope, over the drinks in the Anthropology Common Room. This is where we're going to go through that door and see whether we don't set the fire alarm off. But I think before we do that, we should just thank Ian Morris very much for his talk this evening and the provocation it's starting for us, exactly as we had hoped for on these civilizational issues. So Ian, thank you very much indeed.